Paul and those with him behaved correctly, and they wanted the holy people to be able to concentrate on the good message of Christ, to be able to learn, understand, become holy people first, and then learn, grow in the good message of Christ. They didn't want any distraction for the Corinthians. Continuing in verse 13, Paul says, "You, Corinthian holy people, you knew and you still know, you perceive that the people who are working the sacred things are expending their energy doing works, being devoted or consecrated to God, pertaining to the temple, eat so as to maintain their physical lives out from those things which are taken into the temple." And that also includes, of course, the people who are attending, waiting on or performing service to the sacrificial altar. That is the altar in which sacrifices are offered to God per his instructions. So Paul says, and of course he's looking at the way God had taught people ever since the law of Moses during the Old Covenant times. The people who are working the sacred things pertaining to the temple eat out from the things that are brought into the temple, including those who attend, perform service to the sacrificial altar. What do? They distribute or divide out a portion together or among themselves the food which is offered on the sacrificial altar. That's what these people did with the foods brought into the temple, or anything else that was brought into the temple. This is referring to the true way that sacrifices were to be made for God during the Old Covenant times. Paul says, "Don't you?" And the answer is, yes, we know. Of course, Paul was reminding the Church of God in Corinth how God used to make provision for those who served God during that time in the temple. God didn't just leave the people in the temple and have them to figure it out how they would get food. Paul shows that God made provision for his people, for those service in the temple. They would be able to eat the food that was brought into the temple. They would be able to wear the clothes that was brought into the temple. They were sheltered from the weather by the temple. They were doing, those people in the temple, were doing what God wanted them to do during their everyday living of life. And then the people who worked in the fields, who were doing the plowing or the treading, the people out there working, getting the food, they were also doing what God wanted them to do during the everyday living of their lives. And so, when it all worked for God among God's people, all of them were to partake of each other's work, and they all helped each other to live and maintain their lives appropriately. Those who worked in the fields, and those who served God in the temple area. They were each performing their assigned functions. Paul says, "In this manner also, in which God had made provision for his people during the Old Covenant times, the same is true today. The Lord has also arranged through and through, or thoroughly he has put fully in order, for the people who are messaging the good message regarding the Lord Jesus Christ, to live, to have that fullness of life so that they can maintain their physical lives. How? From the good message, from the fruit produced, by planting, as it were, by sowing that good message among the people. Paul and every person who messages the good message of Christ should be taken care of by the other holy people." Paul makes it clear here to the Corinthian holy people. He says emphatically, "I did not use you. He did not go in there and deem everything that they had as being needful for his use during that time. He said, I did not use not one of these things. Paul and every person who messages the good message of Christ should be taken care of by other holy people. However, Paul makes it very clear to the Corinthian holy people. He says emphatically, I did not deem it to be needful for my needs, for my performance of my function, my assignment. He did not use not one of these things. Again, he uses a double negative for emphasis. Paul did not go in and start abusing any of the availabilities, perhaps, that was there in Corinth. Paul says that he did not use the privileges that he may have had while he was with them as a means to sustain or maintain his own physical life during that time while he was teaching them the good message of Christ, even though Paul may have been entitled to a portion of it. He continues in verse 15, and he says, but I did not write these things in order that thus it may become on me. In other words, Paul did not write this letter and such things as he's explaining here so that it would happen in this manner from now on. This was not Paul's purpose for writing it. Paul was in fact receiving revelation of what to write in response to their questions. He is making sure that they do not think that he's writing this suggesting that they begin giving him all kinds of foods, all kinds of provisions and clothes, or so that they would feel obliged to do this the next time he visited. They were not to base their giving and receiving, their whole living, on guilt or feeling obligated to do something for Paul. Paul says, in truth, it is beautiful. It's acceptably good for me. So it's beautiful for Paul rather to die than... And Paul did not finish the sentence by revelation. Instead, what does he write? He says, not one person will empty or nullify my boast, my subject matter of boasting. Paul messages the good message, and he does not use it for his own personal advantage. Paul was able to write this. He was able to give that boast, to speak justifiably loudly regarding how he behaved himself. Paul was accurate in what he wrote. He needed to write what he wrote. He was not doing it to get something from them, but they needed to understand.